We are immersed in one of the most significant revolutions in man's history. The force that drives this revolution is not social dissension or political ideology, but relentless exploitation of scientific knowledge. There is no prospect that this revolution will subside. On the contrary, it will continue to transform our modes of living and dying.
The Union of Concerned Scientists was founded in 1969 by scientists who wanted to really see public interest brought back into science. That year, this country was in great turmoil, and a large proportion of the science being conducted at the university level was being funded by the Defense Department. So our founding scientists really wanted to see science move away from destructive purposes and more towards solving the great problems facing this country.
The psychological setting within which UCS was founded was created by the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War had reached a crisis stage.
In my department, a few of us had begun to do work on environmental problems. We were dissatisfied with the fact that so much of the research at MIT was supported by the Defense Department. Although it wasn't directly related to defense problems, still we felt that there should be more support for research that was directed away from munitions and military systems to problems of public health and the environment.
I was a visitor at MIT, a visiting professor. I brought 2 PhD students from Cornell with me, and they became very involved with students at MIT, and Alan Chodos and Joel Feigenbaum. And the day before Thanksgiving break in '68, they brought to me a petition to organize a strike at MIT. Somehow that struck me as being, in some ways, of an important concept, and I spent a lot of time over the Thanksgiving weekend redrafting this and making it into not an attack on MIT, but on where the country was going generally, and in particular featuring the nuclear arms race. And then I brought that in on the Monday after Thanksgiving to the office. I brought the 5th or 6th draft. To my amazement, my more senior colleagues that I knew well, Herman Feschbach, who was a director of the Theory Center at MIT, and Francis Lowe, a senior, very well-known scientist. When they saw this, we went into Francis's office, and we didn't leave it for, I think, probably a week anyway. And for most of us who were obsessive scientists, the notion of not continuously doing science was really unheard of. And I remember after a few weeks telling Herman Feschbach, you know, we haven't done any physics in 3 weeks or whatever it was. And Herman said, yes, that's never has happened yet.
So all these strains on campus, Vietnam, student activism, the funding of basic research at the university level by the Defense Department, the desire of scientists, the increasing desire to work on the great problems facing humanity, all came together when Kurt Gottfried and others called that first meeting on March 4th, 1969.
The March 4 event was a teach-in, big teach-in, filled Kresge Auditorium, about 1,200 people. What turned out, unanticipated, to be the high-profile event was a speech by Harvard biologist George Wald, a person who had won the Nobel Prize a couple of years before, who was a spellbinding speaker. The speech was reprinted verbatim in the Boston Globe, and it was also excerpted in several pages in the New Yorker.
There were actually a number of meetings at universities across the country that day inspired by the MIT faculty statement.
Hans Bethe gave a talk on missile defense, which started out with, I'll never forget, by saying, I know you are against missile defense, and I'm going to explain to you why.
After March 4th, the scientists collaborated on several reports which were released under the name Union of Concerned Scientists.
We wrote 3 reports, actually, 25 cents each. One was on missile defense. Another was on multiple warhead missiles. And then there was one on chemical and biological warfare, which was actually chaired by David Baltimore, who was a young professor in the biology department at the time.
After those reports, the organization stayed together loosely. There was a post office box, but no staff. Kurt went off to Europe. Things were pretty low-key until an eminent MIT physicist named Henry Kendall took up the reins.
Henry Kendall, who became for 25 years the chair of the Union of Concerned Scientists, was my roommate actually in graduate school. We lived together for 2 years and became lifelong friends. UCS as we know it is really due to Henry. He was imaginative and had enormous self-confidence and enormous ambition. Those are things that are not often combined with having your feet on the ground. Henry, somebody said, head in the sky, feet on the ground.
Henry was a visionary. He could do anything brilliantly. But he could see a mile ahead of any of the rest of us.
Henry was always fond of saying, at least to me, we need to work on the big issues that nobody else wants to touch because they're too complicated, too intractable, or too long-term, or too hard to explain to the public. And that also meant they were the big ones.
Dan Ford was really the first paid employee of UCS, to my knowledge. And he was hired by Henry to sort of be his all-around assistant, spokesman, to be where Henry couldn't be. And Dan had just graduated from Harvard. And he is a brilliant man. He looked like he was a boyish 30-year-old, but he was really 21. And just the most convincing and articulate and unrelenting fellow. He was terrific. He was perfect.
What brought UCS from this sort of just hobby club to something serious on the political scene was nuclear power. And that was quite early. In 1971, Henry and Dan Ford wrote a report on what became a very big issue of national significance, which is the question of whether a nuclear power plant, if it had a failure, whether the emergency system would function. Now, Henry told me somewhat later that he went into this like a good Boy Scout, is the way he put it. He looked into this problem. He discovered that this emergency core cooling system wasn't going to work properly, and he thought that when he would bring it to the Atomic Energy Commission, they would say, "Henry, thank you so much for telling us this." He said, "That's not at all what happened. They knew the problem. They just didn't want to hear from me."
Bob Pollard was a safety engineer with the Atomic Energy Commission who had become very disillusioned with the fact that the commission was not doing what it should to protect people, that it was simply doing the bidding of the nuclear industry. And he became a whistleblower and went on 60 Minutes with the help of UCS. He approached UCS first with this information. And Dan and Henry got him in touch with Mike Wallace from 60 Minutes. And they ended up doing a segment, a real blockbuster segment. And then Bob opened up, really, the UCS Washington, D.C. office.
From what I understand, it was a fairly lonely crusade for Henry. A lot of the scientists who founded UCS were nuclear physicists. A lot of them were proponents of nuclear power because they saw that as both useful energy at a time when more electricity was needed, but I think also as a productive outcome of work they had done on nuclear weapons. And the interesting thing was neither Henry nor UCS was really anti-nuclear power, although that label kind of stuck for a long time.
Even though in the beginning I didn't support all the activities on nuclear power, I think UCS has had a major influence for the good in improving the safety of nuclear power plants.
When I arrived in '81, I had worked on energy matters before I got here, and ostensibly that's what I thought I was going to do when I came on as the assistant director. And I was on the job for about a month, and Henry had Kurt and others had been thinking about needing to ramp up the organization's focus on arms control because Reagan had just been elected president. He was doing a lot of saber rattling, and people were nervous.
When Kurt Gottfried took a sabbatical from Cornell and worked with UCS, he came to see me to determine whether there was something that he could accomplish during his year. And we decided that we could do something about space weapons and anti-satellite tests. That seemed to be a very good way to start a war on Earth that people, claimed would be limited to space. So we indeed did work up a draft treaty for banning space weapons and anti-satellite tests, and I presented it to a committee of the Senate in 1982 or 1983. So we were all primed when the Star Wars era broke with President Reagan's speech of March 23, 1983.
Reagan got on to national television and announced the creation of his space-based missile defense, which was supposed to make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
In case you haven't noticed, they're still not impotent and obsolete.
As soon as the Reagan announcement in March 1983, we came out with a volume, The Folly of Star Wars, and a little erratum for it. And I think that helped educate people a lot so that the media would call UCS for an independent view.
I remember going to hearings where government witnesses would be testifying, and somebody, some congressman or senator, would hold up our report and say, well, what you're saying does not agree with what's said here by the Union of Concerned Scientists. It was for reasons I don't recall, the report had a very flaming red cover.
I was working very closely with UCS at that time. We had a famous press conference here, maybe in Faneuil Hall, and Hans Bethe and Kurt and I and Carl Sagan, as I recall, were involved. So Carl's presence guaranteed a lot of press attention, which was very good.
A system that's leaky or one-sided, installed by one country and not the other, is probably the worst possible situation. A system that's 10% leaky would, if there were 10,000 warheads on the way, permit 1,000 to reach the ground. And 1,000 warheads, or even a few hundred warheads, could easily destroy the United States.
Up until the mid-'80s, UCS had largely been a loose collection, as just we were talking about, of scientists kind of all around the country, mostly in academic institutions. And we really didn't have much of a technical staff, a little bit on nuclear reactor safety and energy. It really became, there's only so many times you could organize people for free on a volunteer basis around the country. So we began to build up our internal staff of experts. We brought on Ambassador Jonathan Dean as Senior Security Advisor. We built up the research staff with scientists like Elizabeth Grunland and David Wright, physicists who came to us because they had organized one of our teach-ins at Cornell.
For many years, people had realized that the Achilles heel of missile defense was really what's known as countermeasures. And that means decoys and other things that the attacker can do to penetrate the defense.
This is not like the Apollo program, not like going to the moon. The moon didn't jump out of the way, the moon didn't shoot back. The problem here is countermeasures. Faith in technology does not permit you to believe that this defense will succeed, because the technology is more readily used against the system than in support of the system.
So the question we framed was, if a country like North Korea could develop a long-range missile and could put a nuclear weapon on it, what else could they do to defeat the U.S. system? And what we found, which is what we expected to find, is that there were actually several things that North Korea or another country like that could do that would be far easier than building the missile and the warhead in the first place. That would in fact defeat the US system. So we pulled in about another 8 people, some of whom, like Dick Garwin, had long experience advising the government, had a security clearance. There were other folks who had a security clearance. And this is really important to the credibility of the report, because one thing the government often says is, oh, if you knew what we knew, then it's clear that what you've done is wrong. Even though our ability to assess the system was pretty foolproof. I mean, it was really sound because you can't classify physics. When the report was released in April of 2000, we were expecting criticism from the Missile Defense Agency, and we heard not a peep.
We knew we had won in the summer of 2000 when President Clinton decided not to deploy a missile defense system, and he cited the ability of other countries to thwart such a missile defense system with countermeasures as a key reason. This was a tremendous victory.
The climate change issue was something that Henry Kendall was very interested in. He followed it for many years, and he brought it to the attention of the UCS board.
We talked about it a lot, and again, he was very interested in I remember talking about the records of whaling captains and where they encountered ice, and realized that the boundaries of ice were very, very different on the globe today than they were at that time. Yes, we talked a great deal about climate change at high latitudes, and again, I know that has special place in Henry's mind because of the whaling history.
Then it began, there was a really hot summer, if I'm remembering this right, in '88, and the press was beginning to pay attention, very speculative at the time. And as we were sometimes wont to do, we decided we ought to organize a workshop later on that year, bringing some knowledgeable experts on climate change and other issues to talk about trends they saw happening that maybe UCS ought to think about lending its expertise to.
This was the time when the IPCC was just getting up and running. It had its first meetings in 1989. We were present at those meetings and participated in that process. And the IPCC first report didn't come out until 1991, and sort of laid the groundwork for the Rio Treaty the next year that President George H.W. Bush did sign and the Congress ratified. But there was a wide undercurrent of skepticism about the science, and industry groups out there trying to say it's not serious, we need more research, we really don't know all the facts. And this was a real tug of war for the heart and soul of President H.W. Bush. And we helped mobilize the scientific community, the editorial writers, and others to create an environment where the White House had to acknowledge the reality of the issue, had to acknowledge that the science was pretty clear, that there was a problem here, and that we needed to move on to solutions. And I think we played a role in laying the groundwork for President Bush's decision to go to the Rio Treaty, to instruct his negotiators to try to reach agreement with other countries on a deal and bring it back and have the Senate ratify it.
As we got further and further into the climate change set of issues, we began to really realize that good science wasn't enough, and our presence in Washington wasn't enough, but there really needed to be the creation of a large movement to convince and put some pressure on whatever administration was going to be in Washington and elsewhere to start embracing solutions to this problem.
When Henry won his Nobel Prize in 1990, he called me right after getting the message from Stockholm. And it's not something that I mean, there was always speculation that this experiment that would win a Nobel Prize, because it's one of the important experiments in elementary particle physics for the last 25 years. It was the experiment which established the existence of quarks.
The day I remember very well, as I'm sure Kurt and others do, when Henry was awarded the prize, I got a call at sort of 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning from Henry saying sort of, guess what? I said, what, Henry? It's kind of early, He said, well, I'm on my way to Stockholm and I've just been awarded the Nobel Prize, and which was spectacular. And sort of the next comment out of his mouth, and I suspect he'd already talked to Kurt by that point, was, we'll be able to really utilize this in a powerful way, and because we will have a platform that we don't have at present that will enable us to reach a much larger segment of society.
Right after the Rio summit, we put out an open letter to the world leaders called World Scientists Warning to Humanity, which put climate change in the context of other global problems and said we were, for the first time in human history, in a position to affect the physical workings of the planet itself, and that we had a responsibility to step up to the plate and really take a stewardship role.
I think the number of signers at the end included a majority of the then living Nobel laureates, which to my knowledge had never kind of been done before, capturing that consensus view from so many prominent scientists in one place. Got a great deal of public attention and became really a rallying instrument that we use to organize scientists in a much bigger way and more powerful way on climate change and other issues going forward.
By this time, Bud and Alden were tapped for leadership within the groups working on climate change, not only because of their deep experience and depth of knowledge on the issue, but because of our organizational reputation for being rooted in science, but also being honest brokers and effective diplomats. And those skills were especially critical at the international climate negotiations in Kyoto, Japan in 1997.
And Bud Riss, who was UCS president at that time, chaired that delegation and facilitated a lot of the meetings internally to try to make sure that we had a unified front going into Kyoto, negotiating with the administration, including a seminal meeting right near the end of the negotiations with Vice President Gore, who in a very dramatic move parachuted into Kyoto to bring a more flexible U.S. negotiating position to the table. And Bud was able to keep everyone in line to say that if the White House put a stronger position on the table, the U.S. groups would support it and say it was a constructive approach. And in fact, that is what did help turn around the negotiations at the last minute in Kyoto.
During the 1990s, we also built new capacity on key climate solutions, renewable energy and clean vehicles.
We began working on renewable energy in the Midwest and produced this landmark report, Powering the Midwest, in 1991, which was a really in-depth look at the potential for renewable energy playing a major role in the Midwest economy.
We won our first victory on renewable electricity standards in Massachusetts in 1997, and then we moved on and targeted state after state. In some of those campaigns we led, and others we played a supporting role. In many, we were the primary source of technical analysis and policy expertise. And today, 25 states plus the District of Columbia have adopted a renewable electricity standard.
We now project that as a result of these state standards, if they're all successful, we'll actually have over 55,000 megawatts of new wind, solar, bioenergy, geothermal, and other new sources online by 2020. To put that in perspective, that's enough reductions in carbon dioxide, primary global warming pollutant, to basically equal pulling over 20 million cars off the road, or planting about 6.5 billion trees, basically a forest the size of all of northern New England.
When I first joined UCS in 1992 and began working with Debbie Gordon to develop a presence for us in California, she had just worked on an effort at the federal level to raise fuel economy standards. And unfortunately, we did not prevail in that. So we then turned our sights in California to getting other states to adopt California's clean car standards. But it does show that even then, we were focused on requiring the auto industry to make more fuel efficient cars and trucks for the national fleet. So we were very successful in getting California's standards adopted in a number of states. We had tremendous success and in that, and began to build pressure then for federal action again. And then toward the end of the 90s and around the year 2000, we saw there might be an opportunity to begin this debate again in Washington.
In Washington, our clean vehicle staff worked with our allies to increase fuel economy standards in the early years of that decade. But the political will just wasn't there, and we lost a number of votes in the Congress.
Probably the lowest point was in 2005 when Senator Durbin brought a fuel economy amendment to the floor for a vote. And I remember standing off the Senate floor. There were just a few of us there. It was late at night. And we were standing on one side of the doorway, and across from us was a phalanx of auto industry lobbyists. And they were gleefully taking bets on the vote tally. And sure enough, we lost that amendment was defeated 28-65. It was very demoralizing.
When Katrina and high gas prices hit in 2005 and 2006, we were ready with timely analysis that showed how stronger fuel economy standards would benefit both consumers and the environment.
This analysis was used by our allies, our coalition partners, and new allies. It was cited in the press again and again, and it was heralded by Senator Harry Reid as being critical to convincing undecided senators. So in the summer of 2007, the Senate voted again on this issue, and it was in fact, the vote was in fact the polar opposite of what we had seen just 2 years before. And then in December of 2007, I had the honor of standing with my colleagues in the Capitol building and witnessing Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid initialing this historic legislation that raised fuel economy standards for the first time in 32 years. So perhaps it goes to show you that energy and persistence and sound science really can win the day. You just have to help make that day happen.
In the 90s, we expanded our efforts beyond the physical sciences into the biological sciences and brought on board two accomplished scientists, Margaret Mellon and Jane Rissler, to start up our food and environment program.
I think the goal of our program is to transform American agriculture into a system that is sustainable. Right now, it's anything but sustainable. It is based on industrial principles that rely on using large numbers of very similar animals or plants, and inevitably result in the use of a lot of pesticides, a lot of antibiotics, a lot of fertilizer. Agriculture is just an enormous topic, and if you want to change it and you're a program that's limited to 3 to 5 people, you need to look for strategic levers. You need to look for issues that, if you work on them, are going to cause a lot of change beyond what you might think of associated with that particular issue. And antibiotics is one of those issues. The overuse of antibiotics in agriculture undercuts the efficacy of the drugs that you and I depend on for our medical care. What we did was estimate the quantities of antibiotics used in animal agriculture and find that, contrary to all expectations, it was much, much larger, about 8 times about 8 times as much as the antibiotics used in human medicine. That was a game changer.
With that analysis in hand, Marty co-led a coalition called Keep Antibiotics Working that did some really terrific work. They helped develop bipartisan legislation, working with allies in the Congress. They helped convince Tyson's, McDonald's, other large corporations to change their buying practices. And they helped consumers learn to look for the words "raised without antibiotics."
Well, by the spring of 2003, we had been hearing reports, reading reports of distortion and manipulation and censoring of scientific work by the administration. And we were aware that this was a problem. And we then organized a meeting, an off-the-record meeting, which brought in about 15 very senior people to Washington to exchange ideas and to see how widely felt our distress was.
From that meeting, Kurt crafted a statement calling for the restoration of scientific integrity in federal policymaking. He shared that statement with a number of high-level colleagues across the country and got an overwhelmingly positive response. 62 of this country's most highly regarded scientists, Nobel Prize winners, university presidents, scientists who have served in both Republican and Democratic administrations, signed their names to this statement. And when the dust settled, more than 15,000 scientists across this land added their names.
The statement was accompanied by quite a massive report which detailed a large number of cases of censorship, distortion, and manipulation of science across the government.
You might imagine some of our other sort of august bodies of science might have taken on a small piece of it, but and some of them did, but to have tackled this in its sort of full breadth, it's hard to imagine any group having had the collective wherewithal and the resources and the credibility to do this the way the Union of Concerned Scientists did.
There's no question that the visibility of UCS in the scientific community has grown very much, greatly, due to the Scientific Integrity Project, because that touches every scientist of ever, from, as I like to say, from astronomy to zoology.
The goal of the Union of Concerned Scientists tonight, as for many years, has been to inform the public, to provide sound technical advice, to help initiate and sustain a grand public movement. I trust that such a movement is starting. There is evidence of it. We need it very badly. I trust that each of you watching tonight has found our program most interesting, and that it will encourage you to join us to blunt and hopefully to end the nuclear threat. For otherwise, as Winston Churchill warned years ago, the Stone Age may return upon the gleaming wings of science.
Those words spoken by Henry Kendall in 1984 are as true today as they were then. From global security to climate change to these other major challenges, UCS continues to bring rigorous science, creative public policy making. We inspire citizen action to help solve some of the biggest, most stubborn problems facing humankind.
If a very fundamental aspect of the function of our democracy is the full access to information, and scientific information is an important aspect of that, I would argue increasingly with some of the problems we face today. So where does the public get that information? There are all sorts of government reports. There are scientific magazines that are written for the public, for the layman. But if you wanted to go deeper, or if you wanted to find efficiently about the body of science on a wide array of serious concerns today, the Union of Concerned Scientists would be a place to go.
UCS brings a combination of sound technical analysis and policy analysis together with public outreach, constituency organizing, and direct advocacy of our positions in a way that very few other groups do. But we also don't do studies that sit on the shelf. We take this information out and craft fact sheets, craft media strategies, mobilize constituency leaders, communicate the findings, and try to bring pressure to bear on decision makers to follow the science and have policy conform with what the science is telling us we need to do.
With UCS, it wasn't just Henry Kendall, but the opportunity to work with scientists that were in different fields from myself, and to become aware of how important it was that you use all the scientific know-how that our society has to work on these difficult and involved problems. UCS taught me that, I'm glad to say.